Hey, we're back with New World Chaos. We are doing another episode. I'm Jeff. We have Neil and Rebecca. And this episode actually grew out of conversations that Neil and Rebecca and I have been having on our Zooms. A conversation between Neil and Rebecca in particular. So I'm going to let Rebecca tell you about that and we'll get started.
Okay. So, Neil, I just remember something that you said back in early November or something that made me say we should do a podcast. And it was something on the lines of you don't believe in government or something like that. And that just made my ears perk up and say, let's talk about this more. And so I wanted to just explore that, number one, your
Mm.
ideas about government specifically and people and human nature, etc. And then the other thing I wanted to do is I wanted to practice my own conversation skills, and I want to practice understanding what the other person is saying before I argue. So those are my two themes of the day.
Well, I think I know the comment I made. I think it was something along the lines of the problem with the state is that it exists, um, which I overheard someone else say that explicitly in that way, but it's a sentiment that I completely share. And I love the idea of understanding somebody else's argument, practicing the conversation skills. I've been doing something very similar recently. So I think we can both really benefit from that. And I also realize that as I make statements like that, if I reflect upon them, they're not always entirely true. So I'm getting to know myself better through this as well. But yeah, maybe I'll give I can give a little bit of background as to where that statement comes from, and I'd like to maybe then hear what your sort of starting position might be, and then we can enter the sort of process of dialogue rather than maybe just defending positions. That could be fun. Or we'll see how it goes. Maybe we'll end up just defending positions. But so basically, there's a couple of things for me. When I was young and I was so growing up, my grandparents are both my grandfathers were both in the military. One of my grandfathers then became a policeman. They were both royalists. I come from the UK, so there's a natural royal family to be a royalist about, and they would both be considered politically conservative. My parents were politically liberal and rebellious against their parents, and they were quite anti-authoritarian. And so I grew up with this idea that you should be very careful around trusting anything to do with the police, the government, except for my granddad. I'm supposed to trust him, but all the rest of them not to trust, schools, etc., just to be really cautious. But I never had any real personal issues. And then it got to the age where I could vote, and I started to pay attention to politics and just found myself not trusting any politician. None of them come across as genuine to me. And then as I started to read about politics in the press, there was always scandals connected to these people in positions of authority. And I come to the internal conclusion quite early that if I vote for people, I am validating their power, and they may not honor that contract relationship, however you want to see it. And then as I got older, I started to sort of realize that I suppose the thing that's really settled for me is that I don't really feel that anybody else has the moral or authority to tell me how to live my life. And quite frequently, particularly with government, they don't have the technocratic authority to actually govern large populations effectively. Like, like the Minister of Finance 3 years later might be the Minister of Agriculture and then the Minister of Education. And you're like, do you really have that broad set of skills that can operate at this scale and scope? I think not. So I just sort of come to the conclusion that the whole thing's a sham. and that it's not really needed. But then I would left a big void of what should fill that gap, and maybe we can talk about that a bit more later. But that's my starting. That's where I sort of come from with my statement.
So one word that jumped out at me there was scale, because it's pretty clear to me that there's a difference between local government and national government. And I'm wondering how you might see those differences. And, you know, would you say that the problem with local government is that it exists? You know, how do you respond to what I just said, I guess?
In the UK, well, I've worked in local government at different periods of my life as a government officer, so not as a councillor or someone that's been voted into a position of power, but just as an employee. And I found them to be largely incompetent. And the general vibe I got was that kind of, we know better, so we're here to look after the plebs. And that might be particular to the UK. And that's the other thing, is we live in different places, so we have probably do have very different experiences of it all. But yeah, I would definitely extend it to the local government. Should maybe even primarily the local government shouldn't exist. The national government may have some position, but I think that was a lot to do with a sense of competence as well. I don't think that local government people I don't think they hired well. I don't think they really hired people with the right sort of skills or values, really. Like I found a lot of people just be really sort of obnoxious and not caring. That was the thing that really stunned me, that sort of absence of care of what I felt. So yeah, I would extend it to local government, but that may be particular to my experience.
Yeah. So as you know, Neil, I was an elected official in my city for 4 years.
Yeah.
And that was an amazing experience, and it gave me a wonderful appreciation for local government. And so I can't help but filter everything I think and talk about government through the lens of my own experience in local government, and also contrast my experience with maybe what I saw around me, with what other elected officials were doing, how they seem to think about things and behave, and how that changes as you go up the ladder from local to regional or state and then federal. And I don't know how it works in the UK, but you know, everything becomes more and more of a blob the farther you get away from local governance. So anyway, that's my experience in that realm. One thing that you talked about at the very beginning was trust, and you said that when you voted for people, you trusted them to do certain things or behave in a certain way. And I've been thinking about trust lately, because trust is at least two things, if not many more. You're trusting someone not to lie. You know, you're trusting someone to have some sort of basic morality about truth telling, at the very least. And then you're also trusting someone to be competent. And those are different kinds of trust. And competence is a lot harder than just not lying. And to me, truth telling is probably, just based on my own experience as an elected official, and I will go ahead and say an almost absolutely incompetent one, right? Because I had no experience. I was just a person. I didn't know anything about government. I didn't know anything about cities. I didn't know about streets. I didn't know about sewage. I didn't know about unions. I didn't know about fire or police, or, my head was basically blank, right? But I did know how to tell the truth. And what I had to find out was what the truth was, which is the hard part, right? So in order to be competent, you have to know things. In order to know things, you have to learn them. And that's really, really, really hard. And most people don't know much about anything at all. I mean, that's just a plain and simple fact. There's so much to know about the world around us. Most of us are just almost entirely ignorant, and that's just how it is. So we do have to trust each other, and we have to trust each other whether we're elected officials or not. And so I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, except to say that as an elected official, I tried hard to know what I was talking about. And that's what I spent 4 years doing, was trying to learn what the facts were and trying to tell the truth. And I think I did pretty well with that. But, did I do a good job outside of that? I have no idea. I can't even rate my own performance. Probably just the fact that I was trying to find out what was true was pretty darn good. It's that should be most of what is required, I think, of any public servant, or really of anyone at all. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think something that you said there was I really, really strongly agree with, is that most of us are almost totally ignorant of things. And so, and I'm trusting that you mean simply lacking knowledge. Yeah. So, so that for me is kind of the premise of why government, especially in scale, fails. Is largely due to the fact that any of us as individuals are highly unlikely to have the depth of knowledge required to fulfill those types of roles, and perhaps not even the capacity to have it. And when you start to get to like the size of a national government, I don't think it's possible to have the capacity to fulfill those roles properly. So so I'm not against governance. This, I think, is probably really worth trying to separate. When I think about very small scale community models, and traditional communities where elders within the communities were essentially the kind of community leaders, or the people that were referred to for their wisdom, then I think there's a depth of competence and knowledge which is appropriate to the community and the setting. So I think that is good governance. When you start to scale that out to towns, cities, and then states and countries, your connection to the body of people that you're responsible towards, there's a disconnection starts to occur. You don't know people well or at all. That means people don't have a voice, or you don't have an ear for them to reach, or at least it's very, very difficult. And then, on that scale, how could any of us possibly know enough to be able to effectively provide a quality of leadership and wisdom to a community of 10,000, 100,000, a million, 400 million people? Like, it just starts to get ridiculous. So I think governance is still really important within a community, but I think the model for it, to me, feels like it needs to be something very, very different to what we use. And that's where I wonder what the state, like, let's say as a nation state, what is that really? It feels like it's like a bag of marbles, where each marble is a very small community, and it's all just kind of piled in together, and then it's just really, really poorly looked after. Whereas if it were allowed, for me, as you get down the scale towards smaller and smaller groups, the likelihood of competence increases, because there is and also the likelihood of connection. And I think there's a correlation there. I think that the more that people can participate in the governance of their own lives as a community, even if you took like 10 people and then decided those 10 people decided they're going to go travel through the mountains for 2 years, I'm sure they'll be able to govern themselves very well to do that. And there'll be intimacy, knowledge, connection. They'll genuinely care for one another and be able to, pass out what needs to be done according to the skills and competencies within the group. But when you get to 400 million, how do you do that? Like, it just seems an impossible task. And so I think that point about competence being a lot harder, the ignorance that's connected to scale, and the lack of intimate connection between, I like leaders more than governors. I think between leadership and membership of the group. I think as the group gets too big, you just, so many people lose their voice, and therefore it's really hard to make decisions which appropriately represent or support those people, because you just don't know them or know what their needs are or able to factor them into decision making. So I think you've really, really found something important there. And yeah, I'm going to stop talking.
What do you mean when you say that governments aren't doing a good job, or where governments fail, or where nation states?
Okay, yeah. So I think where do they fail? So I think this comes back to what do I think they should be doing, and then how do I measure against that? So for me, I think what government should be doing is a combination of providing safety and facilitating or removing barriers so that people can be themselves, express themselves, live their lives, and so that people can have a standard of living, which again is connected partly to safety, quite a basic thing, sort of basic safety, security, and I guess then opportunity to really be able to try to have a decent quality of life. I could even just reduce it to those things.
So it seems to me that you're talking about governments protecting the rights of the individual and the safety of the individuals within the realms of their governance.
Yeah,
I mean,
I would include in that, as I think about it, I would include in that also protecting the what's the right word for it? The jurisdiction. In the case of a nation, the land and its resources that those people live upon, because we are human beings, we are intimately connected to the earth. We're dependent upon the earth for everything, and so the protection of that environment, as well as the access to it in order to be able to live healthy lives, is something that I think the current government should be providing for. So the current national government should be providing security to its people, opportunity to its people, and protection of the environment as well. And that's not just so that there is a sustainable environment for people to exist in, but to me also there's the environment has its own inherent value. So at least preventing exploitation and damaging the environment would be like a bare minimum. So yeah,
are there some nations who do a better job at those things than others?
I think so, yes. But I honestly at the moment have so much doubt around the information that would validate that without first-hand experience. So when I look at, say, reports or statistics about things, I mean, I don't know whether I should trust them. And that's another thing, I guess, that for me, particularly statistics and things which are produced by governments, I'm just like very wary of whether the content is valid or not. But I would say, yeah, at least in my experience, including having visited quite a few countries, I've been fortunate enough, I've been able to travel around a fair part of the world. Like the Scandinavian countries in Northern Europe seem to be doing a pretty good job. But there's still things that happen there that just shouldn't happen, particularly around environmental exploitation.
When you talk
Yeah.
about the failures of governments or states or nations or of whatever scale, all I hear is a description of humans, and I don't attribute those failures to the fact that those things are governments, but I attribute those failures to the fact that governments are made up of humans. And so you talk about, 10 people going into the mountains, and I just think of houses that I've lived in with 5 or 6 people, and all the drama and insanity and fighting and tyranny and abuse and lack of care, lack of consideration, power tripping, I mean, and love and care and, function and truth telling. I mean, everything that's good and everything that's bad. I've never, the only ideal groups I've ever been in have been in constant flux, and I've experienced groups that are in this sort of wonderful moment, and that moment can extend over a couple years, and then something flexes or fluxes and the moment's gone and I'm in a new group or whatever. I've never I couldn't imagine the ideal government because I can't imagine anything ideal at all. Like, I'm not an idealist at all.
No, me neither. I think I agree with you completely that one of the fundamental problems with governments is that it's members of human beings. I agree that even at a personal level, even just back to family, that people that be close to can be highly dysfunctional, and it's essentially the same problem. How we as humans interact with one another. And that's probably I think that strengthens my belief in that the state or state government shouldn't exist, is because on those very small scales in the house of 5 or amongst family, the extent to which that tyranny can affect people is highly localized. But when you give a group of people power such as a military force, weapons of mass destruction, the ability to seize property and money from others, then those same dynamics can play out with huge consequences for vast numbers of people. So, to use a kind of metaphor of the parent, a bad parent can do great harm to their children, but if that bad parent is a president, the number of children they can do great harm to is scaled up to a point that it's an absolute disaster. So I think you have nailed it there again as to what the underlying the root or the foundation of the issues may come from, which is the sort of an inherent difficulty of being a human being, and so much that we have to learn about ourselves and interacting with one another. But that also, to me, is a really, really good reason why it shouldn't be scaled up to the size of national governments, because then you're scaling up the potential damage caused. It's to me personally. And again, in the same situation, if I was in a house with some people and someone was just being a right tyrant, then I think I would at least be in a position to maybe defend myself, challenge that, or opt out, and just go, right, I'm going to go somewhere else, or I'm going to fight you back, or I'm going to try to negotiate, or I'm going to try something. But when it's the Prime Minister of the UK, I don't have any of those options, yet they can still exert power over me. And that I'm not comfortable with that at all. And I don't think there's any ethical or moral justification for anyone to be in a position to be able to do that. I appreciate that it happens anyway, even at the small level. So there's not any ethical or moral justification for a tyrant in a home either. But I feel like I'd at least have more options on that localized scale. The worst case scenario is I could run away, but I can't run away from here. Like if the government doesn't issue me a passport or decides to invalidate my passport, I can't even leave the borders. So this power that government has over its citizens, to me, is terrifying. Even if it's not acted upon, its existence is pretty scary. So I've got some.
But why is it more scary? So this is what I kind of gleaned from history class, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong. What I gleaned was that as government becomes more and more centralized, and as you have, empires growing, you have an increase of peace, actually, even though those governments may not be, or even though those governments are most certainly not perfect, and even though some of those governments have been most certainly tyrannical, you have a net gain for the people who live within those empires or those nations, because they're not constantly fighting among themselves. And so, I mean, I thought that the Roman Empire was always having regions wanting to join the Roman Empire because they wanted to be under its protection so that they could have that peace. I remember reading a similar thing about empires of Egypt and the role that pharaohs played in just simply maintaining peace, which is the absence of battles among little fiefdoms or whatever. I'm not saying that Egypt had fiefdoms, but you know what I mean. And so I'm just thinking about the state monopoly on violence, right? Or the state monopoly on certain kinds of power. I don't want the state to be violent. I don't want the state to abuse its power. But the fact that it has a monopoly on those things, or at least should have a monopoly on those things, from where I sit, has produced more thriving on the planet than a lack of governments, because of that relative peace. I'm pretty sure that for all the wars that we've had in the last 100 years, and for all the people that have died, per capita, just the lives of the daily lives of regular people are just have much more peace and thriving than they used to do, thousands of years in the past.
So if I'm hearing you right, that the course of history has one aspect of the course of history that is the centralization of government being increasing over time, and a correlation to that, which may be causal, is an increase generally of peace, that there's a net gain, evidenced perhaps by a massive reduction in the constant fighting between small groups of people. And you sort of cited the Roman Empire as being able to provide maybe security, and actually areas wanting to join it for that specific purpose, but also the role of pharaohs in Egypt and it's a similar argument in China as well. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, that united China and built the Great Wall, united a warring kingdom. So there was like the Warring Kingdoms was the name of the period prior to the unification of China under a single system. So I think what I'm hearing is that history, which has led to a state monopoly on violence and of certain power, you feel is the reason why there's been relevant levels of peace. Is that right? Is that the right understanding that I'm
Well, or so I am given to understand.
okay.
Am I right? Am I wrong? I don't know enough to be able to evaluate that, but it seems to me to be the case. And I think democracy is a key question here, because I can certainly think of some pretty horrible national governments who didn't who just murdered millions and millions and millions of people within their borders. So yes, that happened. And so it's not that government in itself produces peaceful opportunities for the common person, but that there's corruption needs to be attended to, this whole idea of political corruption, but just and maybe that's, sorry, I'm like going way all over the place here, because I'm talking about democracy and I'm talking about corruption. And I think that democracy can be corrupted, but that certain types of governments are more corruptible than other types. I mean, from what I see, looking at history, governments based on communism and socialism are a lot more corruptible than governments based on capitalism. And I don't know why that is, but it seems to be the case. Nevertheless, my point is, I don't want to lose a focus on democratic government. And the reason is that at least leaders or elected officials within these governments are accountable to the people who voted for them. And if the people don't like them, they can be voted out, and they are voted out. So to me, that's key, and that cannot be dispensed with. But I know I just covered a huge amount of ground, and I think my little train just jumped about 5 tracks. So
I got some ideas on some of this. So right, if we take the historical path and lead right up to current democracy, that might be useful. So if we go back to like Egypt, ancient China, and probably the Roman Empire, or at least the Greek Empire before that, the worldview then was different to how it is now. Particularly, there was a worldview that the world is essentially power, I mean, you could actually say this view is being revived at the moment, but the worldview that was common back then, the pre-common era, is that the world is power, and that you take your place in it, and you may just be born into a position anyway. So this is why the Egyptians were seen as possibly gods or representations of gods, and I think early Roman emperors had the same sort of title. Early Japanese emperors were considered to be gods, not humans or demigods, and same in early China too, if my understanding is correct. Happily be, I could be wrong on China, but Japan, Egypt, and Rome, I'm pretty certain of. So the gestalt of the period was power, and so fighting and gaining power was considered the norm of how one is in the world. And then there's a period called the Axial Revolution, which will be around the time of like Buddha, Jesus, maybe a little over, maybe similar to the sort of time of Taoism as well. So it was kind of all come along at the same time, and there was a shift from this the world is power, and one either is born into a position of it or one takes it, and that's life, into a different perspective, which is that there is this world that we experience, the material world, and then there's another world which is more real, which is a more of a spiritual world, or a world of higher consciousness, and that our goal is to get from one to the other. So the great spiritual traditions that we currently are still living with really come from the Axial Revolution. So I wonder if some of that changing from the constant fighting amongst themselves towards more peaceful interactions is also to do with a massive shift in the sort of gestalt or philosophical position of pretty much the whole planet, between the pre-axial and the axial revolution period. At the same time, there are, over that same period, you've got, or actually as a consequence of that shift in perspective, you have huge leaps forward in things like language, particularly introduction of alphabets, mathematics, and then as a consequence, social technologies, the ways that we choose to interact with each other, including trade, sharing of information. So I wonder, I see the thread through history of the increase in peace and the decrease in small localized murdering tribes towards a time where people's in the tens of thousands can live relatively safely and peacefully together. And I see the correlation of that in the growth of organized society. But I don't know whether it's causal in that the growth in governance is what gave the peace, or whether it was in fact a more of a flux between, as people's understanding of their position or in the universe changed, they found better ways to interact, and that led to being able to interact with each other on scale and live more peacefully on scale, which in turn give birth to a need to have some form of organization at a bigger level, at a broader level, and then governance may be kind of outcome from that. And then as we head, so I'm uncertain whether the causation's there, but the correlation for sure. I suspect that the causation is more complex and has also to do with the change in worldview that took place several thousand years ago. The state monopoly on violence is it's a really interesting one. Like, I think the monopoly on violence is part of what defines a state, that and a border. If you've got a border and you can control violence within it, then you're a nation state, or a state at least. So let's say that it's been necessary to go along that path, because it'd be really hard to unpick whether any alternative anyway. We don't have like a test group so that we could check against and say, except for this group over here did it completely different. Let's see how that worked out, because it's not, we don't have that, so we can't. So let's say that that's been a necessary and helpful path that we've traveled along. I'd be happy to go with that. And then we get to where we are now. And I think the introduction, I said, we get to where we are now, and I'm wondering, where do we go from here? Like, what is our path of progress and where we are? And we've come a long way for sure. And we're lucky to be born in this time and to have benefited from all of that history getting us to where we are. So I guess my question that I'm now bringing up is there a role for government, national government, from now going into the future? Is it even needed anymore? One thing that democracy, the way we understand democracy rather than ancient Greek democracy, is, I think, highly beneficial, is what you've said, is that there's a much higher degree of accountability and people can select in and out who they wish to be in position of leadership. What I think that affords is more decentralization of government as a process, because then we all get to be actors. So us three could now select Jeff as our leader, or you as our leader, or me as our leader. Whereas perhaps in the past, Jeff would have just drawn his sword and said, I'm the leader, and we would have gone, okay, that's that, or, or perhaps Rebecca did, or I did, or something. So yeah, we're getting to a point where there's increasing levels of participation in which the individual can participate in how they're governed. And what I feel is that that's the thing that's really important to me, is the role of the individual. I look at the individual as being a consciousness in a body that's embedded in an environment, and that's all connected, and we're all connected to one another. So we are collections. And that's actually one of the very fundamentally important and beautiful things about being a human being, is that we're members of groups. And that, but for me, that only really has proper meaning if every individual within that group gets to be themselves. So, and the thing that worries me about even modern government is to what degree that can be enabled when the people making decisions about huge aspects of our lives have no idea who we are. So for me, the further that the governance can be brought back to me as an individual, or to you as an individual, the more that you and I as people have not just a say in how things are done, but actually that we can manifest that somehow, then the greater opportunity there is for us to be ourselves and for us to form collective groups that have much more meaning. Because I think one of the things that's prevalent now is of deep absence of meaning in many people's lives. And I think that's the indicators of that are things like the use of antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications and things like that. So as the scales got bigger, the distance between us and the decision making's got greater. The mechanisms that we put in place tries to afford more contact to our leaders, our governors, and more accountability, or to hold them to account. But I don't see it functioning very well. And I wonder if, in fact, well, actually not, I wonder, my wish is that we find ways to go beyond that, to the fact that we will need them far less. I wouldn't say just, if we were to like get rid of government tomorrow, I think we'd be freaking chaos and murder and theft on scales we wouldn't be able to understand. So for me, this is a multi-generational project of change over time. But my genuine feeling is, however we got to where we are and whatever benefits we've gained from that, I think we need to go towards a model where there's more account for the individual to be able to have responsibility for their own life, and that the way that governance occurs is scaled down to much smaller groups. That's what I think. But I don't necessarily feel that that would return us to small tribes fighting one another. We've learned a lot along the way. And I hope maybe this is a wish or a fantasy, but I like to think that we could keep what we've learned, which is beneficial, and develop upon that and start to shed away the aspects which are increasingly less functional. And I think part of my last word on this, so that we could, again, I'm sort of drifting out into other areas, but I feel that the world is becoming increasingly complex, partly because of the technologies that we have allow for that. And I think that that complexity, to be harnessed healthily, comes back to your point about competency and ignorance. I just don't think individuals are capable of resolving the complexity of issues that we have in the world now as individuals. I think that our only chance, or our best chance, of resolving complex issues and finding healthy solutions for huge numbers of people with such diversity is through highly decentralized connections where we network and we function in a way that centralized government just doesn't allow for. So part of my rejection of centralized large-scale government is that it doesn't have the built-in systemic capacity to solve the problems we need solving, or provide for people to have meaningful lives. But that may be too globulous and abstract to really.
Well, I'm not. So I think one difference between you and me is our expectations of government. And you seem to have very high expectations of what government should be doing. And I don't think I have those expectations at all. You were talking about government. You just said it just now. And of course, I forgot your exact words, or even
Okay.
I should have written it down, but I was too busy paying attention. You were talking about the individual being oneself, and I don't see the role of government in that at all. To me, that's something we can talk about in terms of society and culture. But I would say that that's very different from government. To me, the government just has certain jobs. And I don't think that one of the jobs of government is to provide for individual thriving so much as to get out of the way of individual thriving.
I agree with you on that point completely. That's really my point actually as well. I agree with you. They not that the government should be providing so the individual can be oneself. They should just get the fuck out the way, and they're just not getting out the way at all, in my experience. So just to say that I'm totally on board with you there.
Well, couldn't it be both? Like, provide where it's needed and get out of the way where it's needed? If the goal is the thriving or the well-being of the individual, the government may have several degrees of involvement or not uninvolvement, depending on the situation. So I don't see it as a conflict between the two. I see it as two different strategies, and either one may be appropriate in a given situation.
I mean, I see that as generally, a progressive view of government versus a conservative view of government. I mean, and I think that I think that right now there's this idea of government making everything wonderful. There's this sort of progressive idea of, there will be no barriers to anyone's achieving anything, to the point of everyone's expected to achieve everything or something. And then whereas a more conservative view of government is just saying, nah, let's just make sure that, we have our basic needs are met, and then just let everyone do their own thing and make it work for themselves or not. I mean, do you agree that those two things are generally represented by what we would consider the left and the right, or progressive and or versus conservative?
I think that is the way that most people consider the left and the right. I think that's a pretty accurate portrayal of. You could maybe add to that the conservation of tradition on the right. Whereas personally, I think they're both wrong.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to what you said a little while ago, though, Neil, of talking about the shift in worldview that provided for, or went along with, or was concurrent with a growth in democracy, right? And you were talking about how this idea that the world is just based on power and it's all a power struggle versus I forgot what you contrasted that with, but you sort of
kind of like a two-world model, a kind of two-world model of this is our material physical existence, but there's something higher to be attained.
Yeah. And so the idea that there's something higher to be attained, being a complete revolution on the planet. I mean, not just, I think that's a moral revolution. I think it's, a governmental revolution. I mean, it led to all manner, it either led to all manner of things or was concurrent with all manner of things, including democracy. But it's interesting for me to look at, if we talk about Christianity, or the sort of Judeo-Christian worldview, maybe representing that in the West, but there's this long period of time between that beginning and widespread democracy, and I'm thinking of many centuries of mostly just serfs. And so well, how do serfs fit into this story? I don't know, but I just wanted to not forget about them. And you covered so much ground. I really needed to be making more notes, but the role of individual in government, and I'm not talking about the role of individual in society, which is different. I guess I'm still bumping up against what I see as an essential difference between you and me, or at least in terms of what we've expressed, as what is the difference between government and society? Because to me, when I hear you talking about government, you seem to be using it as like a proxy word for society or culture, and so there's something I don't understand there. Do you know what I'm asking?
I think so. I don't know if I see it that way, but maybe that's what I'm expressing. So it'd be really good to try to get clearer on that. So I see society as this sort of established values, and so there's kind of propositions within their values, like this is what's right and this is what's wrong, or this is what's acceptable and this is what isn't. And then there's procedures or processes. This is how we interact. This is, in in England, we always queue, and if someone treads on a foot, we apologize for having a foot there to be trodden on. And these are the processes and values that are enacted into society. Then there's like perspective. There's relatively shared perspective that forms some form of homogeneous or homogeneity within that helps a society sort of stick, that helps with the stickiness, and that shifts and changes over time. But there's something there that, perhaps relatively shared perspectives on the way the world is, with diversity within it, and then there's the sort of participation. There's the sort of being involved in your community, either local or broader, whether that through how you work, how you act, whether sports you play, what you participate in. So for me, society is that collection of those values, processes, perspectives, and participation that is coherent enough over time that you can kind of label it, or at least teach it to younger people, and it has some consistency, and it also has growth and change. So that to me is society, and for me that's the interplay between the individual and the group, which allows the individual to belong, and for the individual to express being the individual. And different societies have different they do this different societies do this differently, so that some societies are lean more towards the group, and others more towards the individual as just one area to express it. And you can fold into that culture, so art, how we food, all those types of stuff. And then for me, government tends to be around setting out clear statements of those rules. So a lot of society acts on what we inherently believe to be true in some way of how things should be, sort of the values, whereas government sets out things like laws. So to be quite distinct, that they, and then enforcement of, and the other thing that government, to me, where government separates from society, is things such as the collection of money that is then spent to provide utility. So I'm thinking things like roads, certain buildings, in different places, but at least in the UK, education and healthcare are provided by the government rather than organised by the private citizen, so to speak. So that's how, for me, government separates out. And I think the more of the stuff that government does, and the bigger the scale that the government does that stuff on, to me, the more problematic it becomes, which is why I genuinely feel that most things can be reduced back into the interactions between the citizens that make society, without having to have a separate body of people that say, right, this is where the road's going to go, this is how much it's going to cost, and this is how we're going to enforce the collection of money to provide that, and this is how Neil's going to be treated when he breaks the laws that we've decided to put down. Because so does that help? First of all, is that beginning to create a distinction?
Yeah, it does help, and I where I'm still confused is the interplay between basically law enforcement and public works projects and the manifestation of the individual and the individual's participation in law enforcement and public works projects. So I don't, I mean, I can't imagine. To me, government is absolutely required. Like to me, the problem with humanity is that humans exist, but and therefore there's going to be problems with any human system, but the existence of government makes the scale of humanity possible. Like I don't think that humans would be living like we are if it weren't for our governments. And and how much of that is the worldview change that you were talking about, how much of it is other things, I don't know. But when I look at specifically the state monopoly on violence, that is to say law enforcement, and the other thing is due process, both of those things are vital, and they are, in my mind, they cannot be, the government cannot be relieved of that role, and it is essential to have a government to fulfill those two things. And I especially want it to be a democratic government because that's my culture. I don't want some person coming in telling me what the laws are going to be and saying that I don't have a say in that. But I cannot imagine a functioning society without government specifically playing that role. Because I have never seen, as corruptible as government may be, I have never seen a group designated system of due process function well that was not either part of government or duly elected. I'm talking about anything from, a church board of trustees on up. And then the other one, so due process and law enforcement. So speaking of the failure of government and the state monopoly on violence, an article came out by Zach Kriegman, who used to work at Reuters, who was fired for this memo that he sent around to everyone who worked at Reuters News, and he was sharing with other people at Reuters articles that he had read about the consequences of the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the things that he pointed out was the increase in violence after cities' law enforcement structures were demoralized. And he put at a minimum, since the death of George Floyd, he placed at a minimum the excess murders that took place following the demoralization of law enforcement at, I think, 1,500 additional murders. And he put it at, like, I think a high end of, say, 10,000. That's a lot. So that's a big lack of peace there. That's a big crushing of human thriving. And that is directly or only at a slight remove from directly due to law enforcement, the state monopoly on violence. And so I see all around me in the past 2 years and more, the essential role of law enforcement, and not just in terms of murder and mayhem, but also just say theft, arson, other things like that. And all those crimes seem to be not just rising as well, but burgeoning in the United States, especially in some cities that don't enforce a sort of minimum code of conduct, even don't enforce societal norms of the type that have been written into law. So I just simply, based on my own experience working within groups, I cannot imagine a peaceful society without the government fulfilling its role as, in part, a law enforcement agency, as it were. The other aspect of government that I cannot do without and would never want to do without is due process. And again, I know that due process can have its corruptions. Nonetheless, I believe that in situations with duly elected officials being accountable to the people who elected them to maintain due process of law, there's no sane replacement for that. And the less people have faith in that, the more tragic it is for everyone. And I'll just tell you a quick story, and then I'll stop talking because I just talked for a long time. But one of my many roles as an elected official was I was on the vicious animal committee. And so it was a quasi-judicial committee that dealt with dogs. I mean, any animal, but it always ended up being dogs that attacked other animals or people. And so we had to decide what to do with these dogs that bit or killed other dogs or bit people. Luckily, no person was ever killed. Not yet, anyway. Hopefully never. And it was really interesting to see how individual citizens interacted with us as a board, as a quasi-judicial board, with the power to do anything from make you buy a leash to kill your dog. And that was the most rewarding roles I've ever filled in my life, and it was one of the most sacred tasks I have ever had, was to sit in a room with people talking to each other saying, your dog killed my dog, and the other person saying, yes, my dog killed your dog, and the rest of us going, what do we do about this situation? How do we do it without killing the dog that is still alive? And so we did our very best to preserve due process, and it was very, very much focused on the individual. As you were talking about, Neil, we considered each dog, not just each person, but each dog as an individual, each dog owner, each neighbor, each situation. And we were generally very successful in preserving the life of these dogs that had transgressed. And we were able to do that in situations where we trusted the owners to do their part to fulfill the obligations that we placed upon them. The saddest one was when a dog attacked another dog and that dog's owners didn't come to the hearing. And the reason they didn't come to the hearing was that they expressly said, well, we don't trust government, so we're not going to come. So they did not come to defend their dog. Well, because they weren't there, we couldn't meet them and we couldn't interact with them. And so we had no basis to trust them. And that was the only time in my whole experience on that board that we ended up killing that dog, because there was no basis for trying to save the life of that dog, because there was no relationship there, because the people wouldn't trust us enough to come to the hearing. It was tragic and horrible. And I did everything I could to save that dog. I talked to so many dog rescue organizations and I did all this extra work and learned a whole lot about violent dogs. But anyway, it was just a really interesting example of trust between citizens and government, and how that plays out and what that does for a community. So I cannot imagine my life without the Vicious Dog Committee. And I have lived in places that didn't have a Vicious Dog Committee, and people were just shooting each other's animals all the time. And that was awful. And I never want to live in a world like that. And that is why I will always defend government.
Thank you. And there's a lot of value in what you explained there. So there's a couple of, so I'm clear on due process. It's not a sort of direct phrase that we use here, but is it always around jurisprudence, or is it about the application of law or legislation? Is that?
Yes, it's about how legislation is both created and enacted and enforced. All of that, I think, comes under the umbrella of due process. I think specifically due process is really kind of talking about law enforcement and the judicial system. But I have used the term also to talk about just legislation itself and just the processes of government and the rules set forth.
Okay. So, all right. So these areas: law enforcement, due process, and public works projects, and the role of government in maintaining these or enabling, enacting, caring for these things. So it's an interesting one. Like public works projects, I can sort of envisage becoming essentially private, although I think it would take quite a bit of work to establish the means by how that was put in place. But just as an example, I think it was in Switzerland or Sweden, but I'm pretty sure it's Switzerland. A large portion of the country really felt that there was a need to connect two parts of the country with a better road system. So voluntarily raised the money to build the road and just gave it to the government and said, go and do this for us. Although the fact that the people were able to make the decision that it was needed and then contribute towards doing so, I could see how that could have easily gone to a private construction company to just go and build the road. And I can envisage that. Actually, I've seen it in China as well, where when working with rural communities that were missing things like water towers for irrigation systems, and but the Chinese government just wasn't providing these things and had no intention to provide these things. So I worked with a charity called Gung Ho, which is where the phrase gung ho comes from. It's actually from this particular charity that was started in Beijing. And we went out to these communities and said, what is it you need? And they were like, we need water towers, we need these irrigation systems, we need, telephone, like mobile phone towers so that we can communicate. So we just sort of helped them do the sort of research on what these things would cost, and they sat down as a little community and worked out, right, how do we pay for it, and where does how do we recoup that cost, and how do those benefits get distributed within the community? They just figured the rest out themselves and went ahead and did it as a private group of citizens. So how that scales up is beyond my competence to describe, but I think it's something that could be worked out by groups of people, really thinking together. Law enforcement and due process, though, this is the area that I get most stuck on, and like national security, sort of like military. I get stuck on it for a couple of reasons, right? When you're saying about the reduction in law enforcement leading to an increase in crime, like, I completely get that, and I think that was we now at this stage, in the UK, the US are so similar here. We could just say we in our countries live in a system where the right to violence belongs with the state. There may be degrees of where self-defense is acceptable, and I think in different states in the US you have something like the castle rule or the castle law as well, which we don't have here anymore. So, but essentially, unless there's very specific examples, you've got no right to violence. Only the state has that right to violence. So it's not a true monopoly, because people commit crimes, but there is a monopoly over the right to it. So under those circumstances, when you take away those that have the monopoly of right, then it's not surprising that there's an expansion in those that don't have the right, thinking, I can get away with it, because there is no mechanism left in place to contain that, or interrupt that, or prevent that, or be punitive as a consequence. So all of that erodes when you take away the container. For me, the problem is that we've built this container and now we're inside of it. We are now dependent upon law enforcement, and it's not your choice or my choice. We didn't invent law enforcement in our lifetimes. This is something that's progressed over time, but we were born into a system where this exists. So then to just take it away would be as criminal as the people that go around murdering people and stealing stuff. You can't just take away the thing that keeps us safe. That would be crazy. But I don't think that inherently means that that's the only way to solve for things like crime and law enforcement. So I agree with you completely that the consequence of taking away those things now, or even reducing them without real careful thought and planning, is disastrous and unethical, and should not be done. And so therefore we cannot, in our current way of doing things, live without them. I'm totally on board with that, but I don't think that is because they are the best way to go about solving these things. I'm honestly not entirely sure what I do think is, but again, this is something I've been able to sort of witness to some degree and learn about, is that there are in more remote locations, where there are smaller groups of people, law enforcement in some parts of the world doesn't really exist. There are places in Venezuela where sort of tribes of people live without any form of law enforcement. It's just not enactable at all. So they're self-governing in how they interact with one another, and there's sort of the instance of crime are so extremely low that they're almost negligible or non-existent. And that may be because the dependency between the members of those groups for survival is so high. Like if you're not in the group, you're dead in the jungle, that being a criminal within that group is just not self-serving in any way, shape or form. So I don't think you can scale that up to a population of 400 million. It's too easy to be anonymous, right? And to be self-serving. And that comes back to the inherent problem of being human, I guess, as well, like the kind of the things that you spoke about earlier. So I agree with you that the reduction of law enforcement would be a disastrous thing to do with in a population that's dependent upon it. But I think there could be ways to steadily reduce the need for it whilst increasing something else, some other ways of maybe strengthening people's responsibilities, but also maybe strengthening people's ability to self-enforce. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure here. I'm not sort of talking about revenge, sort of blood rights and that type of thing. But another great example of it is so when the Sicilian mafia decided to move to the island of Corsica in order to extend its mafia type behavior and power. Corsica as an island, at least at that time, had a kind of law that everyone is judge, jury, and part of the jurisprudence system. Everyone could enact due process, I guess. That there wasn't a specific group that was elected to do that. Everyone could do that. And so when the mafia attempted to exert control in Corsica, they just got hammered by the local population and were forced straight back to Sicily and just decided they would never go back to Corsica again, because every Corsican was able to say, well, this is against our rules, so I have the right to, I don't know, shoot you, or like my neighbors are going to come around and we're going to drive you off the island or whatever. And they did so successfully. So that's a bit of a narrative, a bit of a maybe even a bit of a fable, but it kind of demonstrates maybe the potential where if people have that level of responsibility, that perhaps things function differently. But I'm not entirely sure. So I got to say that when it comes to law enforcement, I mean, I've listened to people talk about the potential for privatized law enforcement, but I think I have less faith in that than I would in law enforcement that are governed by a democratic process. So I have strong leaning towards the democratic process as being the way in which we have elected accountability, including around law enforcement. But I still, but I don't think that's because it's inherently the best system. I just think it's the system that we currently have, and to scrap it would be a disaster. But I would really love to know more about what could be an alternative to it, which would require, at least in my mind, it would require us as people to have more responsibility and be more self-determined. So it, to me, a re-empowering of the individual feels like it would be a pathway to a reduction in the scale and necessity of government of any type. But I don't think it's something you can just step into. Again, that's why I feel like it's kind of a generational thing that takes time to build. And I may be utterly wrong as well. Complete crap.
Well, Corsica notwithstanding, and other perhaps other, Corsica is not particularly small, but small tribes in Venezuela or whatever notwithstanding, I have a hunch that the way to reduce the need for law enforcement is by having sufficient law enforcement. Because when you have plenty of law enforcement, when you have, and I'm not talking about abuse, I'm talking about law enforcement, law and order. When you have it that sufficiently so that there is public order and peace in cities, that's when you have people able to exist as individuals, uh, healthily, responsibly, etc. And so I just, for example, I live in what looks like suburbia, although I live in a city. I'm a mile away from downtown, so technically I'm in a city, but it kind of looks like suburbia, right? Um, it's what they call a nice neighborhood. Um, the only time I see cops here is when my neighbor calls the cops because he's afraid of snakes. And when he sees a snake, he calls animal control to come get the. And one time there was a
Nice.
fox too at his house, and he called animal control to get the poor fox.
Oh, it's terrible.
But suffice to say, we don't see cops here
Mm.
very much. And when we have issues here, we solve them ourselves. And so, for example, there was a rat infestation among our house and our three neighbors. And we determined that it was improper composting and brush piles. It was basically a rat habitat situation. And so the neighbors worked together to get rid of the rat habitat. I bought some rat traps. I killed rats. Problem solved. The four people involved worked together. We did our part, solved the problem. Rats went away. Well, a mile away from here, people are, there's more cops. there's more calls for cops. There's more rats. There's less responsibility for rats. It is all existing together. And my hunch is that peace is what is provided by law enforcement. And within peace, you can have the function of individuals. And because I don't know, I know what you're saying. I know what you're reaching for. Like, I would like, I would really like not to feel that I depend on government so much. And there are many, 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 many ways that I would like to reduce government in so many ways. and I feel the societal habit of putting everything onto government. And there are so many ways that I see that. And I can't parse that. I can't parse child protective services and the failure of child protective services and the failure of parents to care for their children and the failure of neighbors to take care of their neighbors' children. I can't, I can't parse this out. And it's like, I would like to live in a world where children aren't abused. And do I put that on my neighbors? Do I put that on the government? I don't know what the correct answer is. I feel a very strong suspicion that we as individuals and as neighbors and as communities have offloaded our responsibilities as neighbors and community members. We've put our responsibilities onto the government. And I know why we did that. And I don't know if it was for better or for worse. But, and I don't know where to draw the line. And it's like, why was my neighborhood able to deal with the rat problem, whereas a mile away, those neighbors are not? Because the people with the rats are incompetent. They're not looking after their garbage piles. You know, why are those neighbors incompetent? I don't know. I think, like, is that incompetence the result of too much government in the past? I don't know.
I think something that you said that, okay, so there's two things that I wrote down as you were speaking. One was dependency, and the phrase offloaded responsibilities. And I think that this is a really important thing, that this is a complaint that's been running through the UK for a good 20-30 years, is about the creation, quite maybe even the intentional creation of dependency. This is what I saw in local government as well, was that local government taking away people's choices and making those choices for them. And their thesis behind it was that people weren't capable of making these choices for themselves, and the local government was more competent at making those choices. And then that led to the local population should be thanking us for doing this on their behalf because they're fucking incompetent anyway. And then it was generally a very derogatory sort of ongoing process. A really good physical example of that was the increase of signage. There didn't used to be that many signs about in England, right? But over time that grew into, like, there were signs telling you where you can cross the road or not to touch stuff and where to put things. And an experiment was done in Holland where they took away all the street signs and even the road crossing stuff, and it vastly reduced accidents because people had to become responsible for themselves. So I think there is a balance to be found between provision of service and the creation of dependency. And I think it's probably something that swings pendulum-esque over time as we try to head towards where it works. And it may be needed in different ways over different periods of time as well. So that may be something that will always be a swinging sort of pendulum. But I think that thing about dependency and offloading responsibility go hand in hand. As dependency is created, it becomes easier and easier to offload responsibility. And one of the things that I'm really keen on as a person within myself is the growth in my own ability to be responsible for myself, to be self-determined, to be sovereign as a human being. And with that comes the weight of being responsible. So the consequence for me over time has been, I tend to own my own failings more, and then are able to do something about them and grow. And I've found I have an increasing respect for other people, partly because I realized my own part in problems in my life. It's like, I used to feel when I was younger, things go wrong because of you over there. And I'm aware that this may be how I feel about government as well. Okay, so like, things go wrong because of you over there. So you're responsible. So F you. And then I don't do anything about it. And then as I've become more responsible in adulthood and wishing to be self-reliant and owning my shadow is in a Jungian expression, and becoming aware of my own failings and processes and saying, okay, well, they're mine. I did contribute to this bad situation. It wasn't entirely the other person, or it wasn't entirely government. You know, that I have responsibility in what's happening to me too. And as that grows and is still growing, I do find I have more compassion and respect for other people and for what they may be going through similarly. And I feel like I contribute a great more to society I mean, it's particularly like my immediate surroundings and how I interact with people that I'm in contact with, but also a desire to reach further and contribute in greater ways in the world. And for me, that comes because I feel increasingly independent, and therefore I have to be the one that's responsible. At the same time, I feel my rights are growing too. Like I feel increasingly aware of my rights to be who I am, because actually that's a good thing. Like I heard someone else say this, and I thought it was quite beautiful. My rights are to be the person I wish to be. Your responsibility is to allow me to do that. My responsibility is to allow you to do that. So non-interference as well. So rights and responsibilities, like there's been a big increase in rights in the UK. This is my right. I've got the right to this. I've got the right to that. And not a consequence or a comparative increase in responsibility. So I've got the right to this, and there's no responsibility to match it. And what this person was expressing was actually my responsibility is to everybody else to have their rights. So my responsibility is not to interfere with that. So that's where things like, I think that's where we can define things like criminal behavior. If I kill you, hurt you, steal from you, actively prevent you from doing something, you know, you're trying to get on a bus and I stand in your way and push you around and say no, that's me breaching my responsibility to you to be able to be yourself. At the same time, if you were to just randomly stab me, that would be your breaching your responsibility to my right to just go around and not get stabbed. Okay, so there is real crime and there is real boundary between us, but for me it's inherently connected to having rights and being responsible to each other, as well as responsibility to self. And my fear again and I'm starting to realize throughout this conversation that I have quite a bit of fear around authority taking away independence and replacing it with dependency. And I think that might be my core learning coming from our conversation, is where I come up rough against the idea of government is maybe quite specifically around to what degree is there an attempt or an actual prevention of my independence and creating of me becoming dependent upon a group of people that are so distanced from me that they have no ethical connection to me at all, no moral connection to me at all, no knowledge of me as a being, and as we've said from the very beginning, very little competency. And the scale of things, I think, is really what affects that for me. Scale and distance. Like, so if I was governed, or if the governance of my local area, I'm really lucky. I live in the happiest place in London. Apparently, it's been voted the happiest place in London, and the second happiest place in the whole of the United Kingdom, which is really high ranking, right? And we're in London, but if you were to walk down the street, you probably wouldn't feel that you was in the capital city of this country, we've got horrendous crime and drug problems and all sorts of naughtiness in London. But if you walk down here, it's just like happy, chirpy, smiley street, and everyone's like, hey, cool. It's a lovely place to be. I've not seen a single argument between anybody since I've lived here. It's just amazing. And I know my neighbours. And that's really rare in the UK. We're not very neighbourly anymore, unless you live in the countryside. So there's a community centre just at the end of my street where you can go and join a community centre and get to meet your neighbours and get to participate in local stuff, right? If I was governed from there, I think I'd be all right with it, because I can go there and sit down with people and present myself and be known. And know them, and I think a relationship develops, and within that, responsibility to each other and acknowledgement of each other can occur so much greater. But on Saturday, I had to march to government with thousands of other people on there's a freedom rally on Saturday. And we all marched to protect the National Health Service. In particular, people in the National Health Service were being told that they weren't allowed to work unless they were vaccinated, even if they had a test which showed that they were not ill with COVID, right? So it's about protecting vulnerable people, really important thing to do. The protection of vulnerable people to everyone there seemed to be based on, well, if you've got COVID, you shouldn't be in work as a nurse or a doctor that day. You should be at home getting better and not putting vulnerable people in danger. But saying that you had a vaccine 3 months ago doesn't prove that today you're safe. So what we want is, testing at the door on a daily basis instead of proof of vaccination 3 to 6 months ago. And the government was saying, well, you're going to lose your job as a nurse or a doctor or a surgeon. And there's hundreds of thousands of people that are going to be, at least 100,000 or 200,000 that would be losing their jobs. So we went on a freedom march, and we marched from BBC, from the British Broadcast Centre's headquarters, their main office, right down to 10 Downing Street, which is where the Prime Minister lives. And I don't think it's had any impacts, to be frank. And we didn't get to see the Prime Minister. We didn't get to say, hello, Boris, this is what we feel. There's none of that. And so I felt even then, it's beautiful being in this crowd of like positive people, but I just didn't really feel connected at all to the mechanisms by which decisions are made. Whereas if I can go to my local community centre, I feel really connected to how those decisions are made. And so I feel kind of dependent on Boris Johnson and others making the right decisions that I have no influence over. Whereas at least here, I can go down the street and sit with, Susan and David and say, hey, Susan and David, I think the decision to improve the quality of the swings in the children's park is a good one, and I'd like to contribute to it, and I can participate at some level, So that dependency and responsibility and to me is a really important thing in my life as an individual, and I think is a really healthy part of society. And my concern, my fear, I'll name it as a fear, is that large-scale government creates dependency, which is damaging to the individual and to our relationships with each other, to the point that, okay, I'm not even going to look after my neighbor because that's not my job, that's the police's job, or that type of disconnection from those around us as we offload our responsibility onto bodies of people or institutions. I think there's something inherently unhealthy there. And the other thing that comes up for me is democracy and demos. So democracy being whatever the crassy part of theocracy, democracy, whatever that aspect is, the governance aspect, being connected to the demos, the group, which is great in a good group and is terrible in a bad group. And there are examples of democracies in this world where the demos have, maybe a highly exclusionary of others. And like this almost happened I've got some friends in Bulgaria, and the person that came second in their national election once ran on one policy, which was to force the gypsies out of the country. And they got 45% of the vote, of a national vote, on the policy of excluding a body of people. So if the demos has got some funny ideas, a democracy won't necessarily enact something healthy. So I have concerns around that too. But if I was told you can choose between that and other forms of national governments, I would definitely choose democracy. I'm not going in a different direction. So yeah, that was the thing I was thinking around. But particularly, I think what you spoke about dependency and offloaded responsibility for me is actually the fear around that is connected to the scale of government.
So
And I
did y'all?
think what I'm taking, oh, what?
Go ahead.
Okay. I think what I'm taking away is I am doubting everything I said. Not doubting it's not doubting that I meant it when I said it, but I'm thinking about the animal control board, and I'm thinking about my childhood, which was lived in a place without law enforcement. I mean, there was law enforcement kind of, but it wasn't. Where were they? I don't know. And so there was all kinds of bad things that would happen. You know, child abuse, animal abuse, is all manner of bad things happening without the intervention of law enforcement, which isn't nice. Very unpleasant. Our neighbor shot our cat. Nothing ever happened to him. It's just like, if I had had a gun, I might have gone and shot him at the age of 9.
Yeah.
But and so a lot of what I said in the past hour is informed by having had to deal with not nice people without anyone to help me preserve my rights. On the other hand, there's just no replacement for adversity in personal development. There's just no replacement.
Agreed. Yeah.
And it's like yeah. There's just what's that statement? Weak men create weak societies. Weak societies create strong men. Strong men create strong government. You can
say
strong government
weak men create.
men.
Yeah, you say strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. Weak men create hard times. Hard times create strong men.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like I don't think there's any way to get around that. And it's like, I don't want the kids in my community to suffer. I don't want the animals in my community to suffer. I don't want my neighbors to suffer. I want there to be law enforcement for them. But I know also it's a fact that when you have adversity, you grow or not. You die or you grow in your ability to deal with stuff. And so that question of dependence versus order, and dependence versus responsibility, and dependence versus development, et cetera, that's a tough one. I just don't know.
So have y'all solved the debate or not? Or we got anywhere? We just reframed it.
I think it's for me personally, I've learned a lot about the reasons behind the way I feel the way I do, and I think I've honed in more clearly on why I would still like to see a huge reduction in government. I understand where my fear is and how that plays into me thinking and feeling the way that I do. But also I think particularly this end part where we started talking about that relationship between adversity and responsibility and growth and relationship to one another, that I think that would be actually kind of a really cool point to kick off another conversation from, and maybe to sort of look more into that around fragility and anti-fragility and the conscious meeting of difficulty in life. And I'm thinking of practices like cold water swimming and cold showers. They're quite simple ones, but where you consciously step into something that's deeply uncomfortable and you get so much from it. And I used to practice martial arts, and I used to go rock climbing and do other things where I'm consciously putting myself in risk, danger, adversity. And then I come out of it just thrilled and growing and feeling so much stronger and better. And then looking at things like, you know, the coddling of society, and what role government might play in that. So I think that could be a really interesting discussion. So I don't think we've necessarily resolved anything, but I certainly feel like I've learned a great deal and shifted a bit in my perspective as well. And I've really, really appreciated this conversation. I think it's been a great 2 hours. Really, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Jeff, for hosting it and bringing in the little questions when needed and just keeping it going. Yeah.
And Rebecca, how are you? Did you get what? Well, you've kind of said what it did for you.
Yeah, well, I think I understand Neil's stance and feelings a little bit more. I still have lingering questions on what you mean, Neil, as to the scale of government in terms of the breadth of what it's getting into, or just, you know, the size of the nation. And I definitely agree with this stuff. I'm just like, come on, pull way back. But I'm happy with having a national government. But I will just say that as to cold showers and swimming in icy water and developing strength and fortitude, one of the best icy swims I ever took was my 4 years in government.
That's a great one.
That was one of the greatest developers of my own abilities on so many levels. And it's actually something that I would recommend to everybody. And I actually wonder, if this could be one of the something that can help is encourage more people to run for election of anything, whether it's like run for election to whatever little group they're in, you know, on up, and feel what the responsibility is like, and developing self-development through responsibility, through, of all things, government.
I really like that idea. I think that's a really good one. Yeah, well worth exploring.
Well, thank you then for doing this today. As always, it's lovely.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll see you on the next one. That's it for today.
All right. Nice to see you.
All right. Take care. Thanks again.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.